Welcome everybody, good afternoon. My name's Erin Kearns and this is Christina Fields. We're from SunTrust and welcome to Navigating a Millennial Dominated Economy. I'm real quickly going to go over our agenda, but the first thing we'd like to do is, does every table have a session leader?
So will the session leaders raise your hands?
Can you just raise your hand if you're a session leader? Okay, if you're at a table that does not have a hand raised,
Stand up.
stand up. Okay, we're good. I know that was a little more complicated than it needed to be, but we're good.
We worked through it.
So, real quick, the rundown of the agenda. We are going to, until around 1:45, we're going to have panel discussion. And then from 1:45 to about 2:15, you all are going to have table discussions that are going to come up with ideas based off of the panel discussion that you heard. And then from 2:15 to 2:45, we're actually going to do a little bit of a report out. So we're going to ask for volunteers to provide kind of the big 5 ideas. If we have more than those and we can put them down, we will absolutely figure that out. We want no great idea going to waste today. And then around 2:45 or so, we're going to have some final thoughts. And if we have time, we'll open it up for questions.
All right, so good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen. I am Christina Fields. I'm a bank strategist with SunTrust Bank. So I'm honored to be here this afternoon to introduce our moderator for Navigating a Millennial-Dominated Economy. So Fifi Sun is our moderator today, and she's actually an executive editor at McKinsey & Company. Fifi is actually, her writing has been appeared in Dwell, Slate, Marie Claire, and Atlanta Magazine. And I would like for us to join me in welcoming Fifi as our moderator today.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us today. I'm actually joined on this panel by Dara Brustein, who's the founder of Equitable Payments and 40 Under 40, as well as Jonathan Polk, who's the president and CEO of American Express Bank. So to kick off our session today, I'd love to ask you guys, what do we need to know about millennials? Where are you seeing sort of their biggest impact in the industry that you guys work in? Go for it.
I would say 3 things. The first, from a credit card company point of view, is that millennials really place an extraordinary value on experience over possessions. Their spending patterns are very different. The sound is a little tough in here, you guys. So booming. Help me out, please.
Mic
Thank
check.
you. So where 25 years ago people would want to buy a house, millennials are more interested in taking a 6-month trip to an exotic location and staying in an Airbnb on the way. I know that's a gross generalization, but it's sort of a trend.
Sure.
The second thing is, I think that there is a tremendous amount of energy and enthusiasm for doing things with meaning, and that informs consumerism as well as work choices. And then I'd say the third thing is that this is a generation, unlike many others in the United States, where their prospects for growth and economic success look a little bit different than previous generations that sort of came out of college or high school with a really well-formed sense of expectation that everything was going to work out pretty well. There's a higher level of uncertainty, I would say, these days, economically, than there has been in the past. This notwithstanding the fact that GDP is rising and house prices are rising and everything else.
Great.
This is actually really interesting because I'm sitting here listening to you and I'm realizing we are an interesting juxtaposition, and together we're creating a really interesting example because as a millennial who hates to be called a millennial, I'm on the older side of it, and I apologize in advance for the fact that we're going to be making gross generalizations as a whole and stereotyping, which is fundamentally challenging and flawed in the first place. I'm listening to this and I'm realizing I am sort of the reflection of a lot of the things that I think are recognized as the changes in industry with millennials, where you, by all accounts and for real reason, are truly accomplished in your career, and then here I come and I get to sit on this panel next to you as a millennial who thinks we're so entitled to be doing those things. And so it's interesting to see that. And I'm coming at this from a number of industries. I'm also in the credit card processing world. I own a company that produces networking events directly for young professionals, and I'm a writer for national publications like Forbes and Entrepreneur. And seeing them off in these different places, I think I'm the embodiment of, I think, what your workforce is probably experiencing, which is I only wanted to create a career around which I could be mobile and flexible, and I wanted to have my hands in a lot of different things. And actually just yesterday I was meeting with a publicist who gave me some insight into this millennial generation, and she said, this is the generation known as the slash generation. And I said, what does that mean? Like we're slashing people? And she said, no, it means that you all need to be defined as I am this slash this slash this. And I was like, gulp, like that's exactly me. And I think it really has to do with it. And so, for example, with my company Network Under 40, my entire team are millennials, and they're all remote. None of us have an office, none of us work in the same place. My twin brother and I own our credit card processing company together, and we work across the country together. We've done it for 9 years. We've never been in the same location. And I think these are really indicative factors of this next generation and the way that we're impacting the workplace.
Yeah, we're seeing millennials kind of change the workplace and sort of what motivates them and how they want to work. You talked a little bit about the flexibility, working remote. But we also hear a lot about the way millennials spend and what they want to spend money on. And that's changing really drastically too. Can you talk a little bit about how millennials are different and what their purchasing power looks like compared to previous generations?
So I started to get into this a minute ago with the experience over possessions.
Yeah.
I'd say that's that trend, sort of to put it in a thimble. I would say that millennials are, in many instances, but not always credit averse, pretty deliberate about taking on debt. And that is, from our perspective, an entirely healthy dynamic. Financial responsibility is something that we encourage as a company, and I think it's a good thing for the economy. And a lot of our products are actually not credit products, so that appeals. But what I would say is that what you said about being remote, Dara, and about connecting at any time is a lot of what animates us, not just for millennials really, but anyone. There is a growing expectation, either as an employee or as a customer, there's an expectation that you can deal with whoever it is you want to deal with at any time of the day in any format you want, either online or with a phone, or if you need to go to a physical location. I don't know how many people in the room know FrontGate, interesting partner of ours. It's an online retailer. They sell very expensive sprinklers and things for your backyard. And they are actually building brick and mortar stores because people want to engage not just by internet, but also in person. So I would sort of put a little caveat in the whole digital only thing to say, while we have to be digital, we can't only be digital.
That's a really interesting point, because we are sort of pigeonholed as this digital generation, which we are on so many fronts. But you're right, I think there's sort of this hearkening back now that our generation is almost backlashing and saying we need more human connection, which is what's coming to the experiential part. Is like, I don't know how many of you relate to this, and I truly can't see anything. We're pretty blinded by these lights, so I don't know who's in the audience. But when I saw you walking in, it seemed like a lot of you were young and perhaps millennials, and I don't know if you're like me, but when I look at my credit card, my Amex statement, I see that the predominance is travel. It's Delta, it's Airbnbs, it's hotels, it's Uber, it's Lyft, and that's disproportionately what I spend my money on. And then I spend less and less on other things that historically people would have plunked their money into, like my mortgage is way less. Like I chose to plant myself in the city of Atlanta in large part because the cost of living was less than living in somewhere like New York, where so many people historically would have run to New York or LA or wherever, because I'd rather have the flexibility to say, let me have more discretionary funds to go do these other things, which perhaps wasn't the case in the past. And then from the credit card perspective, I'm curious from Amex, like both being in the credit card processing space and seeing not only how people are spending, but what kind of businesses people are owning and at what ages, and they're opening credit card processing accounts. So many of them have shifted from retail to online. And then so many have become these experiential things, like whether they're retreats or getaways or in-person networking events like I produce or whatever these things are. And it's really attracting people because they're recognizing there's so much you can do online, but nothing competes and challenges the fact that real relationships are built in person, and that so much, like there's a recent study by Harvard on the fact that relationships are the foundation for happiness in so many ways, shapes, and forms. And I think we've underestimated that over the last decade or so, and we're really coming back to that. And I think our spending habits are demonstrating it.
I think it was interesting, a couple of the brands that you ticked off that are frequent appearances on your credit card statement are Uber and Airbnb. And it gets to this whole kind of sharing economy, right? We hear a lot about how millennials are loath to purchase and kind of plant their stake and maybe buy a home or something like that. What are the sort of short-term and then long-term economic implications of that behavior? Do you see this sharing kind of point of view as something that's a trend and fleeting, or do you think this is sort of has long-term, impacts on what our economy looks like 20 years from now because of the millennial behavior now?
Well, I think it absolutely has long-term impacts, and I want to tee you up. Having come from the Fed Reserve, I feel like you probably have a really interesting spot here.
So, I would start off by saying really hard to know,
Yeah.
what kind of long-term impacts, because what we see every day is the confluence of so many different kind of vectors that are driving the direction of things. But I don't think that the appetite for experience, I don't think that the convenience of not owning a car, I don't think that the convenience of staying in a home in a different place and spending extended time getting to know a place as opposed to sort of going there for 3 days, wandering around and then leaving. Like, I think those things are pretty durable trends. The guy at Airbnb came to our office and said that one day he thought that owning a car would be a lot like owning a horse. That was his plan. He said, cars are a thing of the past for most people. At some point in the future, you might own a car because you're a hobbyist, but you wouldn't own one for practical reasons. So I think this kind of trend is going to continue, but where it lands us, I don't know.
Yeah. So millennials are not only the largest generation in history, they're also the largest sector of our workforce today. So Dara, you work with a lot of millennials in your networking company and who are trying to find jobs or kind of meeting people in the same sort of industries. What have you found are some sort of best practices for the way companies should engage with their millennial workforce and really maybe work with them to keep them in jobs longer and kind of stay with them?
Yeah, so I'm coming from a perspective of small business, and you're coming from like very large, like country-sized employee staff. So we'll take this from different points of view. But for me, I think it's always been about authenticity and really relating with people. So like just a couple weeks ago, we brought on a new director of marketing, and when we were making her compensation package and talking to her, I was very direct with her, and I just leveled, and I was like, listen, I'm the CEO of this company, but there's 10 people in this company, so like this is really person to person right now. And I said, you seem incredibly well suited for this job, and I'd love to have you, and here's what we can offer, and here's the roadmap that I'm designing for you. Here's all the reasons why I think this can be great, and here's the possible challenges I think you might be facing, and I want you to really sit on that and not take this job if it's not going to sit well with you. And the reason that I went through all of that and humanized it so much is because I couldn't take the risk of her not being there if she were to just come and try it. Like, again, a stereotype of millennials is they come, they try something, they don't like it, they leave, whatever. I really needed some level of depth and commitment, but I also think something our generation does incredibly well, and perhaps better, if I may, than past generations, is we allow our authentic and true selves in both personal and professional to blend. And I think it has so much to do with coming into this social media generation where, like Facebook started for me when I was in college, and to be able to understand people holistically as who they are bleeds into your professional life in a way that in the past people tried to hide it and wear one hat in one environment and one in another. And I feel like I'm dramatically veering off of the course, but regardless, I think this is an important point that, as I would, I'm a millennial, that in so much to say that I think it's lovely that we get to be in a world now where in work and in play you can be the same person to some degree, and that you don't have to change who that is, and that the people that you're friendly with at work you can be friendly with in your digital life and in your out of work life, and that's important to address. And so with that, I think it's important to be having open dialogue with the people in a company, big or small, who are of this generation, and asking them what is important to you. Like in the interview process, I asked her this, And she said, it is most important to me to make an impact and believe in what I'm doing. And not only did that give me a competitive advantage in knowing how to price her compensation package, but it also gave me deep insight into understanding this is important to her. And if I can make sure that her job fulfills that and she walks out day to day feeling like that was critical and that was accomplished in some way, that she's feeling like her job matters, and that's going to keep her staying with us longer, which as a company is really important.
Yeah.
So I would actually say that while your perspective is different, the truths remain the same. Relationships are paramount in all things, but employment relationships as well. It's a bigger challenge to create a sense of community and a sense of personality in a larger organization. They end up being, I think, large combinations of smaller ecosystems, so you end up creating it one way or another. But employee engagement only occurs when and if people feel like they're part of a team. And for millennials in particular, again, another gross overgeneralization, but I would pick up on something you said. It is very common for us to hear people want to make an impact immediately. They want to arrive and make an impact. And we're like, can we tell you where the coffee is before you? So there's a certain amount of that. And I don't mean to sound too stodgy, because making an impact is essential, and we do expect it. We don't just want to create it as a retention tool. We expect people to make an impact. But it's a little bit about sort of figuring out what that means in context. And I'd say the last thing for us is providing meaningful engagement on what a career path can look like. That's a really strong retention tool and a great strength that American Express has, because it can move people around and get them into different things and train them and cultivate talent. And that's where our emphasis is. It's sort of get good athletes, get good talent, and then we'll sort out what we'll do with you.
Yeah.
I think McKinsey has the same philosophy in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I'd love to hear, Jonathan, too. I'm sure at American Express you have a workforce that's very diverse, in age group. So talk about some of the cross-generational learning that you're seeing. I mean, are millennials developing relationships with, the older employee workforce, and what does that look like?
So one of the things that's interesting about American Express is that we have a very large and robust and vibrant marketing operation. And we also have to have a big corporate finance group, and we have to have compliance. And while I don't want to stereotype too much, I will say there are differences about the traits and qualities that attract people to those different areas.
Sure.
So that kind of informs the answer to your question a little bit. There is cross-generational, and there's also sort of cross type of person thing. In a multi-faceted organization as big as ours is, you'll get very different kinds of people. We're not a monoline in terms of the parts of our machine. So it's an interesting thing. There's a lot of cross-pollination, both in terms of generation, but also in terms of just type of thinking.
Right. A quick question about, so you mentioned earlier sort of debt, right? The way millennials think about debt. And even though they are the largest generation, they're the largest group in our workforce, they historically have less money and more debt than previous generations. So how will that kind of play out, and what impact does that have on the way they purchase and how much they purchase and, the economy at large?
So I don't want to get out over my skis on the numbers here. I think that we've seen a pretty deliberate approach to taking on credit. There's student loans.
Yeah.
But life loans are a little bit different, sort of operating in. So how that plays out is, again, hard to tell. But I think that credit is going to continue to, I think it will be a part of people's lives over time. It will grow. And I think it become a bigger part of their lives, hopefully as they get to manage down student loans, which for a big segment, I don't know you probably have some of these numbers. How many kids graduate with debt?
Highest in history,
I think that must drive your statistic more than anything else.
Yeah. So we have about 5 minutes left, and I think, as you guys know, when we break out into small groups, you guys are going to be working on sort of a solution or a big idea that would really move sort of the millennial-dominated economy forward. so to kind of prep for that, I'd love to hear from you guys. What are some of the challenges or pieces that maybe we haven't figured out as companies and as government and nonprofits? What are you wanting to know about millennials? What's something that you're like, oh, if I found a solution to the way that that motivates them to do something, this would kind of solve a big problem for us? And what are some opportunities for?
Well, there's two things that come to mind for me, and one piggybacks on what you were talking about relationships within large companies. And it's a conversation you and I had a bit, which is, I worked with Coke a couple years ago, not as an employee, just casually having conversations with their executive team, and they continued to talk about this challenge because they're one of the biggest companies in the world, and for them to stay relevant not only in the consumer marketplace, but from a hiring and retention of labor standpoint, they needed to understand millennials. And they instituted something that I thought was really clever, and I think companies of any size should be considering, which is reverse mentorship, where they had younger employees mentoring their most executive leaders and allowing them to ask questions that may have felt stupid for them to ask their peers, or they would have neglected altogether. And then I think it helps sort of enable that self-empowerment piece that younger people often want to feel like they're contributing, and it's a way to do that very quickly, which is great. But a question for me, I think, is really that longevity piece. Is, as a millennial myself, like I've talked about, who doesn't necessarily feel super connected to a lot of the stereotypes around millennials, as I'm on the older side of it, and as an employer, I am desperately trying to understand how do I retain employees in an environment that they're seeking, and I'm seeking, which is 100% remote. And how do you keep their interest and their excitement, yet their sense of camaraderie and all of that amongst themselves to want to stay on board for when the mission starts to feel stale over time to them, because they've been doing it every day.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we find that millennials are the least engaged section of the workforce, even though we're the largest. So I think that's definitely something long-term that we have to solve for. What about you, Jonathan?
I would go back to what you guys said about seeking meaning and purpose. How do you ignite the passion, either as a consumer of your services or as a member of your workforce? Because the passion is there, and in some ways, the challenge of engagement is a function of the fact that millennials, again, disclaimer, often are expecting more connection to their passion from day-to-day work than previous generations who figured they just go to work and it's work, and if you were supposed to have a good time, they probably wouldn't pay you. Whereas these days, it's more like, no, I need to be engaged in something. I spend too much of my life doing this. I want it to be meaningful to me and fun. I want to like the people I work with. I want all that stuff. And so how do you reach that? And there's nothing cynical about it. That's what we want as a company, because it's in our interest if you can create that environment. I think that's why people bring their dogs to Google and tie them up outside of conference rooms and all that other stuff, because they're making work a great place to be. And I think that's to the good.
Yeah.
But the question would be the challenge for the tables. How do you light that fire and get people excited?
Well, and I think the other side of that is perhaps what happens to the industries that are not sexy or seemingly purposeful, and how do you get people to still be a part of those, because they're integral to the way that we operate. Like, who wants to run the ecosystem and the infrastructure? Like I was saying at our table earlier, like I want to own parking lots, but like that's so uncool and so unsexy. And if I really did that, who wants to work in that? Because what's the purpose for them? And so, great. So Jonathan and I are opening a parking lot business. But no, I think that really is an important question of who's going to operate these industries that aren't cool and obviously purposeful and sexy when our generation is fully taken over.
Great. So I think we're going to tee up the breakouts.
Sure. So what we're going to ask you guys to do for the next 30 minutes is kind of think through some of the questions that they pose. So when you think about it, like, what's the big thing that's most important to think, do, know when navigating a millennial-dominated economy? And some of the things that we talked about, or the questions were, is how do you stay relevant with millennials? How do you retain employment and drive longevity? And how do you really ignite a passion in your workforce, especially when it's not necessarily very obvious of the purpose or what would truly be the meaningful outcome? So we are going to give you guys until 2:45, and then we're going to ask for some volunteers to provide kind of their big idea. We're going to document them.